My name is Sundar. I lead the forensic services at Nextime. This podcast is part of Global Anti-Corruption series. Our podcast is an endeavor to bring up emerging topics of relevance for executives across the spectrum of services we offer. Hope you enjoy the podcast. Across the geographies, regulatory environments are changing, business practices are changing, and behaviors are changing with COVID. Anti-corruption in the current environment is bringing newer dimensions with issues around supply chain, healthcare, and other reporting requirements. And there are ever-changing regulatory interventions and the whole new virtual world that we are in currently. In this podcast, we'll be interviewing specialists across regions to gather specific insights on anti-corruption in current times. The region that we would get covered in this podcast is ANZ. I have with me Robert Wyld, consultant with Johnson Winter Slattery, a leading law firm in Australia. Rob specializes in anti-corruption competition and international trade matters, and he has served in IBA's anti-corruption committee multiple times. It's a pleasure to have you on board, Rob. Welcome.
Thank you, Sundar.
So, Robert, I just want to start with this. Now, there's been a lot of changes that have happened over the past few weeks, and how do you perceive corruption risks in the current environment?
In Australia, and I think to a lesser extent New Zealand, there has been not only an intense focus by government, almost from a socialist point of view of intervening in the economy to help manage health and to respond to the economic issues that we have all faced. From an anti-corruption viewpoint, I think from a recent survey that KPMG did, particularly in Australia, there has been a significant perception of increase in fraud corruption risks. The KPMG survey, for example, showed that nearly 2/3 of business who were surveyed saw their main concerns from their dealings in suppliers and employees, particularly remote, because relationships are now cut, they're diffuse, and they're spread across cities and across countries away from the usual way in which business is done and usually supervised. There is also an increased risk arising from the way companies and business deal with contractors, agents and customers because the usual controls and the ability to control has been, I think, weakened.
I can clearly understand where you're coming from, and specifically, of course, there is a significant change in the way businesses are dealing with their own third parties, and the interactions have become more virtual, and those changes are going to have a definite impact on the way corruption risks evolve in the current environment. With that, I just wanted to shift to another important point. How have these risks changed with COVID in the region that you operate in, specifically in ANZ?
I think if you talk about Australia and New Zealand, the most significant aspects are two. One is remote working and the almost shutdown of centralised, socially conscious businesses, not conscious in the sense of not respecting each other, but conscious because they're not with each other and they're all remote. And that, I think, has a significant impact on compliance programs, on supervision. There has been economically, particularly in New Zealand, which had a more severe shutdown than Australia, real pressure from a cost point of view on business. That is, what services can continue as they used to, what are now that wonderful essential or non-essential type of business activity, can it be sustained? And if it cannot, particularly if there's an aspect of compliance, what are the consequences for the business and the impact that may only show up over time when things that we were not aware about come to light?
Yeah, I think I can't agree more with that. It's about we waiting for things that have not come to light at this point in time, and of course the risks of the cost issues in remote workings are spreading across the geographies, not just affecting businesses. It also affects individuals in a significant way. With that, how do you see the regulators and how do you see the change in government touch points? One of the significant things that I've noticed is that the meaning of government touch points have changed over the past 3 months, because there is so much of touch points with government because of healthcare reporting or issues relating to hygiene and safety of people, and including social distancing norms. How do you see that impacting anti-corruption in ANZ region?
I think it has the potential to significantly impact, from a criminal justice point of view, how investigations are undertaken internally by companies, with the lack of abilities to always interview people face to face, or to hop on a plane and to see those key witnesses with the documents in a location. So everything internally has to be managed differently. From a public point of view, I think the criminal justice system has almost come to a halt in Australia and New Zealand for at least 2.5, if not 3 months. That has had a big impact on people, on bail applications, on how criminal proceedings generally, investigative or prosecutorial, have continued. And I think it's fair that most have been in a time warp, passing time and waiting until such time as they can continue, although there is a degree of activity behind the scenes where procedural steps can be taken. But I think fundamentally in Australia, the biggest single change we have seen over 100 years since our federation is what has been described as a national cabinet, where for the first time our federal government has sat down on a weekly basis for probably the last 3 months with their state and territory counterparts, that is the premiers of each state and territory, and the Prime Minister and their senior advisors, working out how to respond economically and how to respond health-wise. And if you look at just simply the healthcare sector, there has been significant movement in companies which were traditional fierce competitors working together, often with the support and authorization of the authorities to permit them to do so, because supplying healthcare products to essential health services, supplying disinfectant to the community, to aged care facilities, to hospitals, suddenly becomes a priority. And if it means employers have to work together, that's what they do.
I can really understand that particular perspective. And one of the things that marges out of that particular thought is that when we speak about government touch points, don't you think that these additional government touch points that comes in for the companies and the compliance officers is a compliance threat? And people who were previously unprepared to deal with government touch points in an appropriate way probably are exposed to that particular challenge. Do you think that's an issue that's going to evolve?
I think it is. I think the better companies and also the better governments are being very proactive in how they encourage people to talk to them, to engage with the government. I certainly think it's fair that all our state governments and our Commonwealth government have been the most proactive they've been in the last probably 100 years in working together in a way that I think if you asked them 3 months ago, in the middle of the Australian bushfire season, when our country was burning, were they working together? The short answer is not really, but we'll get around to this, and fire happens and climate happens. That sort of laissez-faire approach really changed, and I think the community and business see the merit and what can be achieved. The question is, I suspect, how long it might survive for, and whether I think business and society want that sort of more unified approach, which I think is in our best common interest.
I can understand. So moving on to the next relevant thing, now that we are working, and you mentioned about remote working and the healthcare focus, how is that changing the way corruption risks are evolving in ANZ?
I think if you look at it from a purely health point of view in dealing with COVID-19, I think you will find a lot more regulation and red tape now than perhaps business traditionally likes and wants. That is something, however, I think society wants and expects. And I think society and individuals will themselves be reporters against companies and businesses that don't do the right thing. So I think business and the individuals will work together. As to more substantive sort of regulatory changes about law enforcement, about reforms that have been in the system for some time, they remain on the table, but I think they probably are of slightly lesser concern to governments now. I think once the economic position settles and the health position settles, and one has to say that Australia and New Zealand are in a remarkably good position compared to many in the world at the moment, then I think reform and focus on anti-corruption issues will still be there.
I can relate to that. Just extending to that particular point that reforms will evolve there, how do you see enforcement in the coming days or coming months on anti-corruption matters?
Look, I think enforcement in Australia has generally been slow and time-consuming, very expensive, and Australia still lacks a singular regulatory agency, such as a fraud office with dedicated staff and people. People who investigate bribery and corruption at state level are still reasonably proactive in anti-corruption commissions that each state have. They are generally domestic. If you look at the Australian Federal Police, they still tend to be overworked, underpaid, under-resourced, and they lack a cohesive, dedicated agency in the model of a serious fraud office that might promote a more focused approach. Having said that, I think the sort of detailed investigations and ongoing work will continue in the background. These people are still employed, they're still paid, and they will still work. How quickly things will eventuate from an investigation into a prosecution into a conviction remains to be seen. It's a long time.
Yeah, it remains to be seen to see how enforcements are going to be taken up by individual geographies. Coming to the last point, what are the critical points that you think compliance officers operating in ANZ need to take into consideration at this particular point from a ABC and corruption risk perspective?
I think primarily they need to identify the remote working risks or groups within their business that are particularly susceptible to risk remotely working, that is lacking supervision or lacking an involvement of senior management compliance audit in a way that might traditionally happen if they were not remotely working. Secondly, I think effective compliance management is critical and must still be maintained. And really, I think any short-term cost pressure to reduce budgets and to rein in cost will be counterproductive. And the experience I have seen in some large listed companies in Australia is that they are not doing that, and that internal supervision and investigation continue and have been unaffected by the current position, although the process may change. And I think lastly, it's just critical to maintain ongoing training and audit work of all risk areas in a business.
I think I really appreciate the pointers that you shared, specifically the pointer on budget cuts. It's very critical for organizations and compliance officers to be mindful of the criticality of some of these actions in a preventive step of addressing compliance concern in the larger framework of things. Thanks a lot for joining in, Robert, and I think the audience will have a fantastic time listening to your insights.
It's a pleasure, Sundar. Thank you for the opportunity.